Okay, we are set. Mr. Mo Green, how are you doing today, sir?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining the Square Pizza Pod. So you are coming from Winston-Salem today? Is that where you are based out of?
That is where the foundation is based, yes.
Well, we appreciate you coming. So we're obviously still in Charlotte, as I think we're approaching week 16 of COVID, since we've switched to kind of the Zoom podcast formats. We appreciate you joining. So like always, Mr. Green, we're going to kind of get into what makes you and so special, but we always like to start, hopefully a little bit of fun, give our listening audience maybe some behind the scenes about what makes you so great as a person before we get into some of your professional stuff. But nonetheless, if our Googling is right, it appears you like to read kind of crime thrillers and science fiction novels. Is that true?
Well, I do like to read crime thriller novels, yes.
Okay.
Yes, I absolutely do. It runs the gamut.
Right.
Walter Mosley to Dan Brown, to the Lincoln Rhymes series. I definitely like to read crime thrillers.
So if you had to pick one of your favorite, could you? Or maybe like what maybe a better question, like what would you recommend if you wanted to like get somebody into one of these thrillers, like hook them?
Yeah, so I think, so many of what I like about the thrillers are actually the characters.
Okay.
And so, it's probably the characters and the general sort of thing that they focus on. And so if I were trying to get someone hooked in, I would want to understand what type of characters they generally like, and then what sort of basic crime sort of area that they would like to explore.
Very selfless of you. Appreciate that.
Yes.
It's interesting because one of our previous guests was Monroe Richardson, who runs Read Charlotte here, who you may know, but he said he loved kind of watching like The Rock and Jason Statham action movies because day to day his work is so kind of heady and focused on serious stuff that when he gets home, he wants something lighter. So no documentaries, nothing serious. Is that how you got into these books? And is that perhaps a similar reasoning for why you enjoy reading these sorts of books?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I could really pinpoint the reason why.
Okay.
I mean, I like to read, and so I like to read lots of different things as well. And so certainly enjoy reading novels. And then when asked, what particular type, then I would settle in on crime thrillers.
Got it. Okay, cool. I think perhaps another thing we found out about you in prep for this, which might be the most interesting fact we've ever found out about a guest so far, is that apparently your friends and family or one of those two parties attempted to host a roasting of you at one of your upcoming birthday parties, where they essentially maybe needle said person and give them a hard time, but we found out, or at least heard, that you're such a nice guy they couldn't roast you about anything. Is that actually true?
I would say not totally. So first of all, the roast was not for my birthday. It was actually for an organization in High Point, the Macedonia Family Resource Center. They were doing a fundraiser, and so they invited a number of individuals to come in and roast me. And I think they found some things to talk about. Anytime you bring in, I had my first roommate who turned out to be then one of my very best friends, best man in my wedding.
Oh, good.
He came and he was one of the roasters to a few colleagues that I worked with in Guilford County Schools and in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, to a former law partner. So it was a good evening. I certainly, I had a lot of fun listening to what was lifted up about me.
Are there any roasts you feel most comfortable sharing with on today's podcast, or one insight from the roast?
Yeah. So one thing that was funny is, people say that I have Moisms,
Okay.
things that I say or do, and to hear them sort of capture them.
Yep.
When you sort of step back and reflect on yourself, you go, yeah,
That's right.
that's probably about right. I don't want to admit it, but
right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's funny what other people catch up to, catch from a leader saying or somebody else that maybe you don't realize until they lift it up.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's great. And perhaps maybe the last one, and I'm going to cheat a little bit because I didn't put this maybe when we talked about it earlier, but it turns out you're a pretty big Chapel Hill fan. Is that correct?
Oh my goodness.
We have to fight now, or those fighting words?
Yeah, so I did go to a school about 8 miles away from Chapel Hill.
Fair.
And I certainly respect Chapel Hill.
Sure.
Fine institution. But I'm not sure that however you phrase it, I don't know that I could sign off on that.
Fair. I related. I think I was born in North Carolina, but grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and so with football, we very much had the Ohio State and the team up north rivalry in our household. We don't even say that name in our house. So at least when I came to the South, I appreciated the immediate intensity between those two schools as well, because I felt a little bit of a kindred spirit from the rivalry up north. So respect nonetheless.
It's real.
Yeah.
It's definitely real. It's a lot of fun. And
so, kind of transitioning a little bit, and we're going to get into what you've done in your past and day to day, but want to zoom in, I think, on the topic that we've been focused on with our podcast, but also just the day to day of our work around COVID. And knowing you're leading one of the largest, kind of foundations in the state focused on supporting the future of North Carolina. We'd love to just hear quickly how COVID is affecting the day to day at the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation.
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, sort of operations I'd focus on, and then certainly grant making.
Yeah.
So on the operations side, since mid-March or so, we have been working remotely. As earlier in our conversation, you'd asked where the foundation is located, and it's in Winston. I actually am in Greensboro.
Okay.
And have gone into the office only a small number of times since then. We were able, I think, operationally to transition pretty well to working remotely and continue doing what we're doing. We have become, if not experts, certainly quasi-experts on things like Zoom.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and so operationally, I would say things have gone fairly well. On the grant-making side of the house, certainly we have made several adjustments.
Yep.
With regards to grant making. We did some things for our grantees early on, things like extending deadlines when certain things were due, trying to lean into being supportive of grantees in general. And then part of what we've also done is tried to figure out where we think we can make a positive impact on North Carolina and North Carolinians. And so the trustees have made decisions on some grants in some particular areas, things that many foundations may be doing, I would say, and then some things that maybe not as many foundations are doing. And so as examples, certainly providing direct assistance and support to individuals, through things like food banks or the Diaper Bank of North Carolina, those sorts of supports. to things like that may be in a different category, is focusing on fair and safe and accessible elections, looking at how we might deal with workers' rights and conditions and safety issues, to dealing with things like reimagining education, which I imagine we'll talk some more about.
Yeah.
While perhaps not directly COVID related, certainly related to another huge issue of the moment. It's not just of this moment, but it certainly has come to light even more in the last few weeks around things like law enforcement accountability.
Sure.
Those would be the sorts of things that the trustees and the foundation have been up to, and as I say, I think made some good shifts with regards to dealing with operations, and then I think tried to lean in and provide resources where appropriate on some critically important issues.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. I think, one, thanks for your work as always. Two, thanks for how quick you and the team, I think, responded, right? I think we're obviously based in Charlotte, but have been able to work in other communities, and so have at least our eyes, or at least our social media eyes, on other communities, and so can see which foundations and groups are responding quickly, are a bit more innovative than the others. And I think you guys certainly rank high up on that list. So kudos to you guys for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we'd love to kind of pick up where you left off. On this podcast, when you say things like reimagine, future, and education, those are things that we have to zero in on immediately, right? And so knowing that you guys have previously, before COVID, done so much work to fund really incredible groups in North Carolina focused on education, tell us a bit more about what this Reimagining Fund looks like.
Yeah, so it is really to be determined what it's ultimately going to be. So as organizations were having conversations around the state about where things are, and how to really sort of transition so quickly to remote learning and getting through the rest of the year. I was in some early conversations with an organization called the Innovation Project, which is an organization that the Z. Smith Reynolds has funded for a number of years. And in those communications was really talking about, I think it's critically important that the districts and the state focus on certainly helping to transition to remote learning, thinking about all the things that we need to do to make that successful. Right. Think about how to be sure that kids are being fed now that they're not being fed through this coming into the class to schools. Yep. And then at the same time to think about, well, is this a moment?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, is this a moment where we might think about how we might do some things dramatically different than the way we've done them before? And if it is, how do we begin to take advantage of this moment? Mm-hmm. And so those conversations ultimately led to, and there were different conversations being had with different individuals, with different organizations, ultimately led to the foundation deciding to make a grant to the Innovation Project. Mm-hmm. And just so for context, the Innovation Project is a nonprofit organization based here in North Carolina that is made up of about 20 or so superintendents that are trying to do innovative work within their districts, and then supporting each other in ways to move their districts and ultimately the state forward.
They're almost like a learning community of soups focused on innovation.
That's correct. Great. That's correct. And so really felt like as we were having some of those conversations with even individuals with the State Board of Education, in fact, the State Board shared that they would really be supportive of us providing a grant to the Innovation Project, because they think that that's a group that because they're led by sitting superintendents, would have a good sense of what might actually would work.
Yep.
And where they might stretch themselves. And so we made a grant, and we really said, and the Innovation Project leadership really bought into this, is that issues of equity are critically important. But how about we not define where this might go? Let's be open to allowing some thought leaders and various folks in various sectors within education, and perhaps even outside of education, guide the thinking. It's almost like, here's some money. Essentially, you have a blank slate.
Yep.
What would you come up with?
Wow.
And then see how that then might get turned into ways of reimagining education. And so that's why I said at the very outset, this is a to be determined.
Yep. And is that, I guess, for our nonprofit groups out there listening, is this an open fund that they can also apply to, or is this just through TIP that has to go through the Innovation Project, or is there something in between?
Yeah, so we made the grant to the Innovation Project. Okay. And the Innovation Project, I know, will be reaching out to various individuals and organizations to help sort of think through how to operationalize, this, reimagining. Yep. And I'm sure to think about how to be sure we've got, a lot of the right voices in the room that can really be innovative, if you will.
That's great. And is some of the hope that some of these kind of innovative plans are ready to be tested, if you will, by August or whenever school is back in session?
So I don't know that there is a specific timeline. Okay. I think it would be a bit aggressive. Yep. To think that these might be put in place by this August. Sure. I think that would be a bit aggressive.
Yeah, I think, that's incredible. One, because of just the opportunity to do it, but two, I think from other guests on the podcast, we've talked about like what it takes to just innovate or test something in education, particularly public education. And not that, unfortunately, you needed a global pandemic for maybe leaders to get the grace to do it, but just to really begin to think about like what does research and development and testing in public education look like, while still being respectful of teachers, of superintendents, of families, and most importantly of students. Kind of how do we do that in a way that's balanced, but still allows us to be innovative? And so this seems like a really unique opportunity, as you mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well stated.
Would love to kind of hear too, like maybe tell the people, so we're biased because we've researched and know so much about the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation and the amazing work. I think it's 80 years we saw that's happened across North Carolina. Maybe back up a little bit and tell the people more macro what Z. Smith Reynolds is and what they do.
Yeah, so Z. Smith Reynolds is a private family foundation that was founded, you're correct, a little bit over 80 years ago. And it has in its organizing documents that it is to, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it's to accomplish charitable works for the state of North Carolina. Focus solely on North Carolina. Yep. But charitable works has and certainly continues to mean lots of different things over that 80 plus years. The very first grant that was made by the foundation was to try to help eradicate venereal diseases. Wow. In the 1930s. And so I always like to lift that up because it begins to suggest a little bit of the DNA of this foundation, which is it's one that's willing to sort of get out there and try to do some important work that maybe other foundations might shy away from. Yep. So what I would put in the more traditional category of scholarships and, things, direct services. Certainly, this foundation has certainly done that as well over the years. But this foundation, I would say, has really been about trying to think about how do you make substantial change in ways that will benefit all North Carolinians, particularly those who have been marginalized in our state. And so, over the years then, the foundation has focused in a number of focus areas. Before I arrived, the foundation had about 5 focus areas, if you will, to include public education, but also included issues around the environment and democracy, and community and economic development, and issues of equity. And so then, really actually before I arrived, the foundation with my predecessor was at a place, the trustees and the staff were at a place where they were thinking about, okay, maybe we ought to see where the state is, where we think the state is going, where the foundation is, and where the foundation may be going as well. And so did that analysis, started that analysis with my predecessor, and then continued it with me. And so we did a lot of listening and learning, and ultimately came up with our All for North Carolina framework for grant-making and learning. Yep. That has 3 major strategies and 3 commitments. So the 3 strategies are around state-level systemic change in 4 areas, 4 priority areas that still include public education, issues of the environment, issues around democracy, and social and economic justice. We then have a community-based strategy that has a couple of different components to it, but that strategy is without regard to a particular focus area or priority area, if you will. It's really about trying to get deeper into communities across the state. Yep. And then the third strategy is around something we call exploratory visionary ideas. So one of the things that we heard when we were doing our listening and learning is we were reminded that we're one of the few foundations that doesn't have a specific area of the state that it has to focus on, or a specific sector or issue. We can be that entity like we were in the 1930s that can say, why don't we focus in this area or that area? Right. And so we decided we'd have this exploratory visionary ideas area. And so we started with 3 initiatives. I'll tell you about those quickly. Yeah. One is around municipal racial equity. So with municipalities as they're trying to deal with racial equity issues. We created some opportunities for some municipalities to do that with some ZSR funding. Yep. My second area is around something we call All for NC Fellows. So these are younger individuals, 21 to 35 years old, who have a big idea. And we are ultimately decided to fund 4 of these individuals, give them $75,000 and allow them to go off and work on their big idea for a year plus. Wow. Okay. And then the third category is something that's focused on, we call it inclusive public art. So when this initiative was first being thought about, one of the significant issues of the moment, as it is now, are issues around race and deep conversations that this state and, in fact, the nation must have around it. It was also around Confederate monuments. Wow. And so one of the reemergence of these conversations. Exactly. And so one of the things that we said is, as people are talking about whether to leave up the monuments, take down the monuments, place them in some special location, put some placard of context with the monuments, etc., one thing that we said was, well, maybe we ought to figure out how you could add to the conversation by saying, well, if you take them down, then what?
Yep.
Or if you add a placard, then what?
Yep.
Or if you just even leave them up.
Then,
Aren't there other stories that are important for North Carolina? And so we actually allowed for essentially requests for proposals from across the state. We got 80 plus from across the state. We had a committee that helped us narrow that down to the 10 that were actually selected that basically are across the state with ways of lifting up issues of individuals or situations that have gone unrecognized or underappreciated or under-recognized across the state, particularly people of color and women. In particular. So it was interesting that COVID-19 hit just as many of these communities were about to have their public unveilings, if you will, of their projects, which I thought even in this moment would be pretty timely if we could allow folks to see, well, here is what might be really enriching for our communities, because these are intended to be public and essentially permanent art projects across the state. And then quickly, I'll just say I've got the three commitments. Those are around learning. So we're going to continue to learn as a foundation, certainly focused on our hometown of Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, and then the foundation's committed to using the racial equity lens and all that we do.
I mean, there's just so much to dive into. I'm going to have to extend the podcast for a few more hours. I mean, I think, the part around conversation and training, particularly to the monuments, is really important too, because, I think there's conversations of like Mississippi removing the state flag, which is really good. I think a lot of people probably listen to this podcast, and hopefully most people would agree with. But I think really smart to your point, like, well, what happens after that? Like, it's a symbol, an important symbol to come down, but like if there's not any type of conversation about why it came down or what it meant to have it up and how we're going to move forward, is bringing it down enough? And I think that's a really important piece to lift up.
So, and we believe, I mean, if you look at the 10 projects that we have across the state, there are just some amazing stories that can be told about North Carolinians and the contributions that they've made to their communities or the state or even beyond that. And so, because you take down a X monument, but then what do you put back up, if anything? And, how do you engage communities in that conversation? So many of the monuments around the Confederates, were put up by a select few number of folks who said this is what they wanted to put up across the state. Well, this was a way for us to talk about or have communities talk about what it is that they really thought was important for their community. What would they want to lift up in their communities? And so it's been neat. I mean, it's been fabulous to even of the 10 that are selected, range from things like recognizing African-American males in Rocky Mount with these huge billboard type photographs and then accompanying stories, to things like the U.S. colored troops being recognized in Wilmington, North Carolina, to a football team that went undefeated for multiple years. And in one year, actually, this is before integration, not only went undefeated, but went unscored upon.
Wow. As a former linebacker, I appreciate that stat maybe more than others would. So thank you for looking that up. Not an easy thing to do.
Very good.
I think to build off that, what I love about that strategy too is it's focused on the stakeholders that are nearest to maybe the pain point, if you will. I think it's a quote we borrowed from Brian Stevenson a lot around just staying proximate to those you're trying to serve and seeking the change. And so, having the funds and the ability to do it and the leadership from your guys' perspective is so important, but then having the lens to say, let's go closest to the people in the community that have lived these experiences for so long and ask them what it means to them and what suggestions they have. Because very similar, we had Carrie Cook on the podcast, and we're talking about a lot of reports, and a lot of reports are needed and important to get everybody on the same page. But oftentimes the people closest and most proximate to the pain point of like said reports aren't surprised by the recommendations, because it's very likely they've been saying these same things for 5, 10, 50, 100 years. So how do we get them into the conversation sooner to lift up their answers that they know to be true?
Yeah, so I certainly think that, the foundation operates on multiple levels, tries to support individuals and organizations that operate on multiple levels. And so there are absolutely times where I think it's important that we go to academia or to some of the more statewide nonprofit organizations, because they have the bandwidth to know what's happening across the state, or they have the history, the expertise that's been developed, et cetera. But I think it's equally as important then, if not even more important, that we also go deep into communities and listen to folk in communities. And understand that they also have significant experience and oftentimes have expertise as well. And so figuring out how to listen to really folks across that continuum to come up with then solutions that will benefit all North Carolinians, and then in particular those that have been marginalized in our state.
Yep. And I think without an innovative foundation, obviously within our state, luckily it'd be hard to do. So I guess the follow-up question there is, to frame this in the positive. So if we wanted to say from your perspective, like advice given to other foundations or leaders in your space to be more innovative, to maybe begin to bestow grants that aren't as cookie cutter as what some foundations are. Like, how do you get your trustees, or what advice would you give another leader of a foundation to say, hey, here's actually like a systematic way to try to be more innovative, rather than kind of going the normal route?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I think foundations can have different purposes. So not every foundation has to serve the same purpose or go about it the same way.
Good point.
So there are some foundations that I think do a wonderful job of providing sort of direct services, support for direct services, and that's needed. I mean, there are folks who are today in need of food. And so if every foundation were working solely on the policy levels, there then may not be those who are being sure that people are being fed
day to day. That's right.
Day to day. And so I think that's the first thing, is let's not try to suggest everyone needs to be the same type of foundation or fill the same gaps, if you will.
Okay.
Now, for those that I think are thinking about how they might move from where they may be, to thinking about, perhaps being aligned with or similar to a Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. I think those are the foundations. What I would suggest to you is those are the ones that are asking the additional questions and saying, but why? Why is this person hungry today? And if the answer should pose or cause you to pose additional questions, and those will lead you to posing additional questions and having to go search out answers either in the communities or, again, where there might be folk in other nonprofits or in different sectors. And so now what can we do to help those individuals? And so that may require some folks do some advocacy work with the with policymakers.
Yep.
That may require that you're supporting organizations that are putting out information. So the foundation does a lot of work with media outlets, because part of what needs to happen is people need to become more aware
Yep.
of what issues there are. So to me, and as you begin to ask more questions, the more I think one will begin to see. I mean, you'll begin to see the disparities that exist in our communities. And so then, but why is that?
Yep.
Why is it that, African-American males in Guilford County were getting suspended out of school 3.4 times? I mean, as a foundation, you say, well, but why is that?
Yep.
I mean, and what does one do with that information once they have it? So that's what I would suggest, is open up, give yourself a willingness or the ability, I guess, to ask the additional questions, to not be satisfied with the answers you get, because I think they will lead you to thinking about funding in a different way.
I think it's great. Yeah, asking the questions and then having, I think, just the wherewithal to get those answers, but then formulate a plan once you have those answers and you've asked those questions to be able to respond to it, right? And so I think you guys are certainly leading by example in that way, and hopefully more kind of stakeholders in similar positions do that as well.
Yeah, very good.
Would love for you to quickly, I know quickly is maybe an oxymoron with the next question I'm about to ask, but before you filled this role with Z. Smith, you led a pretty significant school district in Guilford County for a number of years as a superintendent. So you have, incredible experience through Charlotte, with legal counsel, and I think COO at one point, then leading Guilford County and now on the funding side. But if we just focus on Guilford County as the soup, in one word, describe to us how that experience was.
Yeah, I don't know that I can come up with it.
Okay, you can use a few more. You can use a few more than one if you want.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's just no way. I could come up with one word to describe the experience. I mean, so as you know, Guilford County Schools is the third largest district in the state, 70,000+ students. Certainly also working in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which was one of the top two as far as number of students in the state. So you're talking about huge operations, running some of the biggest food systems and bus systems and number of facilities and number of employees, et cetera. And so, managing a budget of those sort of magnitudes, that kind of magnitude is
I
amazing.
don't think a lot of people realize unless they're in it, but $1 billion organization.
That's correct. Yeah. So CMS absolutely was over $1 billion annually.
Yep.
And so, from that vantage point is just the magnitude of things. But I was always, I used to tell folks that I revered educators. And so I was constantly blown away with the way educators would always want to figure out how to do the next best thing for their and all of our children.
Yep.
So that was something that was overwhelming for me. Trying to figure out how to lead. An organization that was doing good things, is doing good things, but not enough of those good things for all children.
Yep.
And so how do you, at the same time that you want to talk about revering educators, trying to motivate them and everyone else in the organization and the community to say, we've got to do even more and better for many of our children.
And yeah, I think that's great, and would love, if you're the, kind of a two-part question, but if you're still the soup or the other soups out there, knowing what you know now from that incredible experience, but then layering on top of that experience, the unknown with COVID and how schools and districts, particularly with the size and the magnitude you mentioned, the hurdles they have to clear to reopen schools, whether it's remote, hybrid, or, I don't even think back to normal is a realistic thing to say anymore. So I guess just like, what are you thinking now as somebody's maybe like Monday morning quarterbacking this, or just like advising other soups thinking about it as they're currently in these roles in response to COVID?
Yeah. And so one thing that I think about when I think about superintendents and other leaders in districts is they are people who figure out how to get things done.
Mm-hmm.
So even with limited resources, they figure out how to get things done. I think we're actually in a place where it's going to be extremely challenging to figure out how to get things done in a way that will ultimately serve children well in either the hybrid model or the remote learning model.
Yep.
And so I assume people know when we're talking about the hybrid model, that is sort of this combination of perhaps some remote learning and then some in school activities.
8A, B-day situation, or A week, B week. Yeah.
Correct. So some hybrid model. It's going to be extremely complex and complicated. And so part of what I would be saying to leaders is, don't get down on yourselves.
Yeah.
There's almost no way to make this completely right. With the resources that you've been given, and the timetable that you've been given to do it in,
right,
surrounded by the panic and worry that people have. Yep. And, one thing about schools is everyone's been to school, so they think they know the right way to do it. And so, give yourself, don't be so hard on yourself.
That was almost the best advice one of my mentor teachers gave me, was that if everybody was a brain surgeon, there'd be a lot more theories on brain surgery. But since there's such a small population, you don't hear a lot of people lifting up thoughts. But on teaching, on the other hand, everybody's got a thought.
Yeah, well, wise words.
Right.
And then I would actually be flipping it back to our community.
Yeah.
And actually saying that I think it's important that we give our educators and our educational leaders grace.
Yep.
We have got to do that because, just in any moment, just pick one thing like masks.
Sure.
There was a time when we were told don't have to wear masks. So now it's essentially mandatory that you have to wear masks. So the messages, the issues, they've changed and morphed over time. And at the same time, you're talking about trying to, run an educational institution without all of the facts, information, and resources to run it.
That's right. And
you've got all this, worry and panic and concern surrounding it. And then people are coming to this institution with their own sort of issues of trauma and baggage. And so I would be saying to our communities, give our educators and our educational leaders some grace. Yep. and flip it then the educational leaders. Don't be so hard on yourself. Do a good day's work. But don't try to think you can solve everything in this moment because you just cannot.
A lot. Yeah. No, I think that's remarkable, and also love the fact of, saying flip it to the educators, to speak to them, to hear what they need, because from so many of our experiences, we had such quality teachers or educators, they'll do whatever they can in a normal situation to reach every kid and to support every kid. But even now, how much more important that will be. Then also maybe even taking it further back to what you're talking about with the artists is talking to the families and the communities. And, we've been saying that, this school year is going to require 10x the amount of communication and partnership with families and students around like what's safe, what's not safe, hybrid learning, remote learning. And it's only going to be done well, I think, with the schools and the systems that build true partnerships and trust with families to even know that it's going to be a physically safe space to send their babies back to school amidst the new health concerns.
Yeah, and I don't think you can overpromise.
Sure.
I mean, and here we have, just this past weekend, states who opened up.
Surged, yeah.
And then saying, well, maybe we got to back up on that. And it's one thing to back up on, a bar or something.
Right.
But when you open up with schools, and even if you do a hybrid model, and you back up, you're talking about my babies now. Those are mama's kids. And so all of a sudden, that's a whole different sort of conversation. And so that's where I say, let's not sort of overpromise, what's going to be. I think it's a mistake to think that we can say what's going to be safe or not safe. I mean, we know the best we know with the information we've got, which is very incomplete.
Yeah, I guess great. One question I want to get to too, and know that, we talked a little bit about the work of Z. Smith, how important is focus on equity and race in North Carolina, but also race relations in the state, and really likely a leader across the country. Something we think a lot about in terms of, we can't have a more equitable future unless we're having more transparent conversations around race and gender, both the history of that in our country, within the educational system, and also creating maybe a new or innovating on a new educational system. So, as a leader from your space, we'd love to hear if you're able to share just how race has affected you or been a part of your work in your educational experience.
Yeah, so, I certainly would say that race has impacted essentially all of my existence. And that's both positive and, I would say, negative or more challenging. And so there isn't, I'll tell folk, my antenna is always up around issues around race. Yep. I'll just give you a couple of examples of, something I shared with my team as we were dealing with, our country's dealing with law enforcement accountability sort of issues, and shared, back when I was at Duke as an undergraduate student, I was the president of the Black Student Alliance. And one of the issues we were dealing with many years ago were feeling like Black students were being harassed by the Duke Public Safety Department, Law Enforcement Division, being stopped constantly and asked for IDs, and almost given this sense that we didn't were we really welcome, if you will, on Duke's campus by the law enforcement community. To a place then where I also shared that in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, when I was deputy superintendent, we did have in addition to having school resource officers with the various municipalities across the community, and we also had our own law enforcement. We had internally folks that reported directly to me, and so was able to have my eyes open to many things that we were seeing and having to do within a school system. And so race played a huge factor in both of those sort of situations. And gives me, I think, has given me sort of this real appreciation of how complex some issues are related to race, and how people approach these issues in different ways. And so trying to figure out how to move people forward, I think, has been part of what I've learned over the years through my journey, and that journey again has been influenced with race at every corner.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's, again, one thing now more than ever, so important that I think we all have these open and honest conversations, but also productive ways and ways to move forward together as a country, but also to listen. And also me as a white dude in the space to understand like what I know and what I don't know. From my teaching experience, from me growing up, my own experience, but also now as a professional in the space, and think, so many of these conversations are important, but also dynamic, as you said. And even most recently, which I don't think a lot of got as much news, but like the Rhode Island story around renaming Rhode Island because their full name is I think like Providence Plantations, which of course is referring to slavery. And I don't know about you, but that's not something that was like a title chapter in my history book in 4th grade. And as much as I've tried to read and educate myself on all these issues, that's something that completely caught me off guard. The Deep South, you know about and hear about, but not Rhode Island. And then as this comes up, you're like, almost, well, hell, like, America's wrestled so long with racism, but it's just more like, I think there's more that even so many of us don't know, and maybe Rhode Island just being one point, but there's just so many just varying aspects that it's just important that we lift up what we know to be true, but also continue to research and ask why, to your point earlier, to really understand, where we are and why we're currently here in this space in our country.
Yeah, I think it's critically important. Yeah, so there are, yes, as I was mentioning earlier, as an example, one of the things that we were confronted with in Guilford County Schools was this statistic that African American males were being suspended out of school 3.4 times as often as white males.
Which I think is sadly probably consistent in Charlotte and Wake, and it's not.
Absolutely. And so, it's very easy in those situations to say, well, there's something wrong with the students.
Right.
And you could certainly point to an individual incident and say, well, yeah, that student, under the code of conduct should be suspended out of school for that conduct.
Yep.
But when you start to ask the deeper questions and step back from it, you begin to sort of see that there must be something systemic going on here that is causing us to do that to students. And that's where then, asking questions and asking then the leaders and others in the school system to say, well, why is that happening? And then what should I individually or we collectively be doing differently so that we don't have the outcomes that we're having?
Yeah, I think that's right, and appreciate you lift that up. Going to get you out of here. I, again, could talk to you for as long as you'd let us, but we're going to get you out of here as close to the time as possible. So maybe 2 more fun, lighter questions, if you will, as you wrap up. So you talk so much about innovation and how it kind of works, and it's baked into the foundation. If we asked you what's the most kind of innovative just thing that you're seeing in public education today, can be related to the foundation or something else. What's exciting you right now when you think about the future of public education?
So I would lift up, 2 or 3 things. It's hard for me to lift up just one.
Right.
So I think you could go around this state and, I would suggest folks that spend some time in like Edgecombe County, Edgecombe County Public Schools, and how they're thinking about reimagining education and really sort of centering students. I'd think about the Innovation District, with Roy and Salisbury. That's not exactly what it's called, but with Lynn Moody, and then something that's probably not as new, the Renewal District. So then something that's been in place for a while, but I still think is truly innovative, has been the early middle college model here in North Carolina. It certainly exists in other locations, but to think about how you're combining basically high school and college, and putting high school students, particularly the model that puts the high school students on the college campus. That's pretty innovative, and I think it has improved the graduation rate across the state. I think it's allowed individuals, students to see their tomorrows today. It has certainly saved parents money as those students then go on to continue college if they've already taken some college courses while in high school.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the more innovation one could do around that, I think would be well received. So, yeah.
And I know the early colleges are popular options still in Charlotte and a few other communities you work into. Okay, as always, the last and most important question, what does square pizza remind you of?
It just reminds me of pizza.
Did you have square pizza growing up in public schools in North Carolina?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. They did. I can recall times when the pizza came out as if not square, maybe rectangular.
Rectangle, yeah.
Yeah. If not perfectly a square, certainly a rectangle.
That's right. Yeah. You know, rectangle pizza probably would have been a better name, but it doesn't roll off the tongue the way square pizza does.
Yes.
But and maybe this was like because my geometry teacher wasn't very good, but we always called it square pizza, even though it was rectangle. Like I never once heard anybody say rectangle pizza.
That's right.
For whatever reason, that just never stuck. So a marketing analysis needs to be done around like why rectangle pizza never took off.
Yeah. So I don't know what others say, but when I think of square pizza, I still think it's still pizza.
There you go. Yeah, that's right. Still good, right? Well, Mo Green, thanks so much for all you do. Thanks for taking time for dropping some knowledge and wisdom on us today. We'll make sure to link in the show notes so everybody can check out you and all the great work Z Smith is doing.
Excellent. Greg, thank you so much for having us and giving me a chance to share a little bit about the foundation.
Great. Thank you.